Thank you all for coming. I'm Terrence Washington. I'm here at the National Gallery in the Academic Programs Department. I'm super excited, to say the least, that we're hosting this program with David Driscoll speaking with Curlee Holton as part of their Living Legacy National Speaking Tour. Curlee's going to do a much more substantial introduction of David right after this, but just as a much less experienced art historian, I want to say how amazing it is to be able to spend time with David, who, I mean, thinking about the sort of stars that I sort of have come up thinking about in art history, Faith Ringgold, William T. Williams, Jacob Lawrence. David, as an artist, obviously keeps their company, and then as an art historian has been part of putting them sort of into the constellation I get to look at every day, which is pretty great. I'll introduce Curlee very quickly, and then he'll come up and we'll get started. Curlee Holton is a highly regarded professor, painter, and master printmaker, and he has exhibited his work all over the place, all over the world. His paintings, drawings, and prints are held by major museums and collections in the US and abroad. He earned his master's in fine arts from Kent State with a concentration in printmaking, and his bachelor's from the Cleveland Institute of Fine Arts in drawing and painting. He served for a long time as the David M. and Linda Roth Professor of Art at Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania, where he taught printmaking and African American art history. There, he founded in 1996 the Experimental Printmaking Institute with a vision to provide artists with the time, space, materials, and professional support to create new work. And in 2014, he was appointed executive director of the David C. Driscoll Center for the Study of the Visual Arts and Culture of African Americans and the African Diaspora at the University of Maryland, College Park. Please welcome Curlee Holton.
Well, thank you for being here and sharing this moment with David and myself. I'll tell you a little bit about the Driscoll Center. You can see the slide up here. Many of you are familiar with the Driscoll Center and our programs. And Driscoll Center is unique in many ways. One way that is unique is one of the only research and study centers in the country named after an African American artist. And we are proud of that and proud of the legacy that David has passed on to us. And again, not only is it David's legacy, but it's a legacy of replenishing and expanding the field and appreciation of African American art. And some of you attended the exhibition that opened on Thursday, 15 collectors. I think you got a sense of our mission and how it manifests itself in the real world. So this speaking tour that I'm talking to you about was, of course, established at the Driscoll Center with a great deal of support from Larry and Brenda Thompson. And that support came about one evening. We were having dinner in Washington, D.C. with Dr. Everett and her husband, Ralph. And we were talking about Howard University, David working and being mentored by Lois Mailou Jones and not Hal Woodruff, but James Wells and James Porter. And he shared with us a lot of stories that, no one knew about, especially stories that aren't written down in the history books, which is intriguing to me. And at the close of that conversation, my role was to provoke David a little bit and bring that information forward. As the Thompsons mentioned to me as we were about to leave the restaurant, that if we decided to do a tour of David's conversations and to do talks about it, they would underwrite it. So we proposed that we do a dozen talks around the country. I think we've done 5 so far, and we have a scheduled talk at Houston Museum of Art, New Orleans, University of Delaware, not University of Delaware, but Delaware Art Museum, and a number of others. But let me tell you a little bit about David before I bring him up, when you talk about personal stories. I met David in 2003. I was introduced to him by Riley Temple. I don't know if Riley's in the audience, but I did invite him. I was a professor at Lafayette College, and Riley said to me, who was on the board of trustees, why don't you bring a David Driscoll to Lafayette? So I invited David, and he agreed to come. So we began to work in 2003 on a series of prints, and we've produced over 50 editions since 2003. But what we did also was promote his work internationally, because I had studied in Latin America, and it was important. I had shown in Japan, had a gallery that represented my work in Japan, so I thought it would be great to show David's work. So we arranged for an exhibition of David's work in Oaxaca, Mexico. Now, I refer to David as the super duper maestro. So let me tell you how he got that name. We're in Oaxaca, Mexico, being hosted by Rolando Rojas, a very prominent artist who also owned a gallery and a restaurant, and so he hosted the exhibition. Now, when this exhibition opens, the way it formally happens is there's a big red ribbon in entrance of the gallery. We all stand outside. The audience, the crowd gathers, dignitaries speak. The mayor was there, Oaxaca, and others, and they speak and pay homage to the arts and pay homage to the maestro. Well, the maestro, which is a sort of Spanish term of identifying an important teacher, an artist of distinction and great regard. So you're walking down the street and they will greet you and bow and say, "Good morning, maestro." So David was a maestro, we all know that. Well, during this event, I was standing outside and I turned around looking for David, and David was missing. David had slipped under the red ribbon, had gone into the gallery space, and they just had attendants in the gallery space and waiters. David's talking to everyone. I think he was drinking a little mezcal and juice, actually. He'll tell you he doesn't drink, but I think he had or tequila, I'm not sure which. And I realized he was inside, and this is not protocol. So I ran inside and got David and brought him out and said, "You can't do that, David. This is done a certain way. You have to wait until they cut the ribbon with you." So they finally cut the ribbon, and David goes in, and they're greeting him. And as you can see here, they're interviewing him. This is his first one-person international show, which was surprising to me. Now, he's been in a number of group exhibitions internationally, but this was the first international show. So our host, who I mentioned owned the restaurant, also had a private chef assigned to David. So each morning David would get up, the private chef would cook whatever David asked for, lunch and dinner. And David was asking for all kinds of exotic things. You know, David will take advantage of a situation if given an opportunity. So this chef was just cooking up a storm. I think this was the first time David had his own private chef, but we were having a great time. And so after that, those artists would not only greet David as maestro, but they called him the super duper maestro. So that's where that name came from, and that term. So David has done a lot outside of the U.S. also. This is a shot of David in Delphi, Greece. And I'll tell you a story about Greece and our visit to Greece, which is quite a story, and also San Jose, Costa Rica. If we have time later, I'll tell you those stories. But of course, beside the accomplishments internationally was David's continual achievement nationally. Of course, we all know this, his reputation as a scholar, as an artist. And a great story about how he got to Howard. I think he'll tell you that story. But just a little bit, he arrived at Howard because he was going to college. Didn't know you had to apply to be entered into college. And David would just show up on campus and walk into anybody's classroom. So they had to stop him, and then he applied. But he'll tell you that story. Well, of course, you can see his accomplishments, his recognition for his 2 centuries Black American art exhibition that was groundbreaking. And of course, his teaching history and teaching accomplishments and being honored by President Clinton. You'll see a shot of that a little later. So we are well aware of David's unique contributions. And now we have a shot of David working on one piece. This is a print he was working on. But David agreed to do the Living Legacy tour. Now, the primary reason for the tour, and I told you the reaction of the Thompsons, was to tell that story a story that's not necessarily in the history books, although he will talk about history and achievements, but to personalize it. And it was important to the Driscoll Center, and we consider David's story to be our greatest asset. We have a great library, great archives of David's papers, a great art collection. But for us, the greatest asset is David's story and how David lived his life, his generosity as a teacher, his humanity, and we try to create programming that reflects that. So David is, for us, a national treasure. So with any other delay, I'd like to bring up the super duper maestro. He could grow a mustache, but he couldn't grow a beard at this time. This was just his beginning as a young student, and was distinguished. Even as a young student, his teachers would fight over him, whether he's going to be an artist, whether he's going to be an art historian. So I would like this conversation to be about his being a student and how he got to Howard, and then we can talk about achievements later on. Can you tell the story of getting to Howard?
Well, I assumed, if I'm talking a little loud, you'll excuse me. I had a problem. I can't hear out of this ear for the time being. And I'll make it very short because many of you have heard this story before. But I attended a little four-room segregated high school in western North Carolina in Appalachia. And we had very fine teachers because at that time in the segregated, certain parts of the segregated South, the state that you lived in would pay its black teachers to go out of the state to any graduate school that they wanted to attend to keep them from having to go to the University of North Carolina or any of the white institutions. So our teachers were very well prepared. One fourth grade teacher, for example, had a doctorate of education from University of Michigan. And so we were exposed to the very best, even within that system of segregation. But their notion to us was that if you don't like the farming and whatever was going on there, the way out of this, and this was also the philosophy of my father, the way out of this is through education. And so having that kind of experience, our teachers would say, you must go to college. So out of our little class of 24 people, 18 of us went off to college. And I guess I was the most enterprising one in that I got on the train in Kings Mountain, North Carolina, and came to Washington. Luckily, I had two sisters living here, and showed up, and my brother-in-law said, oh, you came to get a job? And I said, no, I came to go to college, and I'm going to Howard University. And the next day, I just walked up on the campus and tried to enroll, had my report card with me, and they said, no, school has been in session for 3 weeks, and you don't just come to college, you have to make an application. I said, well, I'm here, give me one. So that ensued, and finally they said, no, you can't just do this. And they said, if you go home and don't come back until January, we're on the quarter system, then we'll make sure that you're properly enrolled. I paid them no attention. I went on and sat in them classes. And I always say it was not the students in Greensboro who were the first set in as I was at Howard University. Well, anyway, when I finally got enrolled, and I won't make this any longer, I enrolled in history because I had the notion that I was going to become a history teacher. And the second year, I decided that I would take an art course because I always had this great interest in art. Went over to Thurkill Hall, where the art department was located at that time, and enrolled in Professor James L. Wells' drawing class. And I was drawing one day, and a gentleman came in and looked over my shoulders and with an indication that I had some talent. And he said, what is your name? I don't know you. Are you an art major? And I said, no, I'm a history major. It was James A. Porter. And he said, you don't belong in history, you belong here. So I went and changed my major. And that's how I Got to Howard University.
That was the beginning of the story.
That was the beginning. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about studying with individuals like Porter, Lois Mailou Jones, James Wells, and others, the influence they had on you as a young artist?
Well, we saw them as major artists, which they were. Washington at that time was still a segregated city, so you wouldn't see much of their work in the public domain. Lois Jones and James Wells were in the collection at the Phillips Collection. It was called the Phillips Memorial Gallery at that time. But you couldn't see any of their work in other institutions. And I often mention this to the credit of especially this institution, National Gallery of Art. At that time, there were only 3 places in the nation's capital that African Americans were welcome to come and eat. One was the Severin Station at Severin restaurant at Union Station, the Methodist building across the street from the House of from the legislature, and the National Gallery of Art. So we would come here on Sunday afternoons to eat and to hear the lectures and what have you. Our teachers encouraged us to do that. And Professor Wells taught drawing and printmaking. And he was a very well-liked teacher because he wouldn't get on you if you missed classes that much. Lois Jones, you had to be there every day. And Lois would line us up all the works that we did daily. And she would give prizes. We didn't get any money or anything like that. But she'd give out a title. First place, second place, honorable mention. So we learned the process that way. But it also caused not the best feelings among the students. So
Did you ever win the prize?
I won the prize most of the time. So that wasn't, and when I won the national prize, which included Georgetown, Washington, Catholic University, University of Maryland, Howard. At that time, it was still Minor Teachers College, now District of Columbia. I came in the next day to find my painting thrown under the seat with a blue tag of first prize. Well, I won the first prize. And I always say that painting got me into Skowhegan.
Can you talk about Skowhegan a little bit? I know you were being recommended to Skowhegan, and you were one of the first undergraduate to get into Skowhegan. Can you tell about that?
Well, Howard University had a scholarship to the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture from its inception in 1946. And students from all over, 65 students were selected from the time it was founded. It's still 65 students. At that time, I understand you could almost pick the students out on hand, and they would have maybe 100 applicants. And some were designated by the school that they attended. Today, they get close to 3,000 applications for those same 65 spaces.
Yeah.
So even in the beginning, it was highly regarded, international students and what have you. And so that I was chosen in my junior year to go to this prestigious school was really all but unheard of. And there I made the acquaintance of artists, some of whom are still alive, that I still have associations with, Lois Dodd and people like that, Alex Katz. I was in the class with a gentleman by the name of Robert Clark. He changed his name to Robert Indiana. So there were people of stature even then who were there. So Skowhegan, then, the only major summer school in the United States that has that kind of art school, that has that kind of prestige.
So it's kind of formative for you in the
Yes,
sense that
yes.
you were now not just in the small environment of Howard University. This was a larger national, international environment.
National and
Is that why
international.
you're in Maine now, because of that?
Well, yes. I came back in the fall of 1953, and I told my wife, Thelma, I said, all famous artists go to Maine in the summer. And they have homes, they have studios, et cetera, et cetera. And one day we had to have a home studio. Well, we were living with her mother. We didn't have a home. But as blessings would come our way, I think it was 8 or 9 years later, I was teaching at Talladega College, but I was also in graduate school at Catholic University. And I would read the Christian Science Monitor, the newspaper, that was one of the few mainstream newspapers at that time that reported on the work of African American artists. There was a page called the Home Forum page, and a woman wrote the art criticism by the name of Dorothy Abloh, wonderful writer. And she would include Tanner, Duncanson, Bannister, Jacob Lawrence, Romeo Bearden, artists that we didn't get in any other form of the media. And so I read it religiously for that reason, but I also was having such a difficult time with my French examination. I had to pass this 12-page French exam at Catholic U. I don't know if they still do it, for the MFA. Not for the master's, but for the MFA because it's a terminal degree. So we had to take the same exam that the PhD students took. So I read Mary Baker Eddy's sermons up here in English at the top of the Home Forum page and in French down below.
Ah.
And that's how I passed my French exam.
You still speak bad French, don't you? That's what Rodney says. So.
Je parle français très bien.
Je ne sais pas. All right. But anyway, can you talk a little bit more about becoming a teacher, moving from Howard to Fisk University, where you became chairman of the art department, but there's also chairman of the art department at Fisk.
Well, prior to that, I had taught at Talladega College.
That's right, you
in
told me.
Alabama. And even though I was the one-person department, I had to teach everything. And when they asked me ahead of time when I was applying, right out of college now, no master's, anything like that, can you teach painting? Yes. Can you teach graphic arts? Yes. Can you teach ceramics? Yes. I hadn't had a ceramics course. But I wasn't going to pass up the chance to get that job.
Sure.
Paid $300 a month.
Say yes until you can afford to say no, right?
Yes, indeed. So I studied, I kept ahead of the students by studying, and we would go out. We got to the point where we were good enough to go out in the countryside, dig the clay, process it. I'd order the glazes. We'd make up our own glazes. And one of our students, a gentleman by the name of Hans Bala from Pakistan, he was an economics major, but he took as many art courses as he could with us. And he had this great interest in ceramics and graphics. And he went directly from this program at Talladega with no major to the MFA program in Cranbrook. So we had concentration in areas of study that really were good. And
But
strong.
you were also trained very well. You trained in a very classical way. You told me that you used to have to grind your own pigments to make your own
yes.
paint. So you understood egg tempera, you understood how to prepare.
Fresco, all of those things. I taught a course called Methods and Materials of Painting. And I had that course with the famous paint manufacturer, Leonard Bocour, at Skowhegan in 1953. So I came back and instituted some of that in the program at Talladega. But when I came to Howard in 1962, Professor Porter allowed me to introduce that as a course of study. And a number of the artists, Washington artists like Lou Stovall, Sylvia Snowden, and many others, they took that course. And we would grind the pigments just like they did in the old days. We would do fresco painting, and we may have been one of the few schools at that time doing frescoes. Egg tempera. So I took them through all of that, and this particular view of students at Fisk in that class.
So you were sharing this knowledge with these students, this background, this history, this understanding about the arts in a role that African American artists weren't present. So you were carrying a responsibility. So I know you were down in Talladega, as you mentioned earlier. Can you tell me how the environment, how the community dealt with your presence? Didn't you tell me there were marches on the campus? by
Oh,
the Ku
yes.
Klux
Well,
Klan?
that was in the 1950s. George Wallace was governor, and the Klan was very active in pretty much all of the counties around. And we had marches on the campus. They'd come through. We were, I recall, one night having the Christmas program in DeForest Chapel, 19th century kind of neo-Romanesque building, beautiful building there. I was later commissioned to do 65 stained glass windows for that chapel. And we had the Hale Woodruff murals there. So the campus is almost like an art campus in many ways. But anyway, we were in chapel one night singing Silent Night, Holy Night, and all that. And we saw this blaze out front. And we said, oh, they lit the Christmas tree early. Well, the Klan had come and planted a cross in front of the chapel. And had only one security guard, and no telling where he was. So, but those were the days when those kinds of things happened.
Yeah, and was it when you were at Talladega or at Fisk where you could only take African American students to the museum one day a week? Was it Negro Day?
Well, that was true pretty much of all of the museums in the South at that time. Hale Woodruff had broken the mold in Atlanta in the 1940s, but in the 1950s, when I went to, he could take his students from Spelman over to the High Museum. But when I went to Talladega in 1955, there was still only one day in the week when black people could go to the museum in Birmingham. That was a Tuesday. That was called Negro Day. And I have photographs of my having taken my students over there on Negro Day. In my class was a young man who later became a very famous minister. It was my minister at People's Church, Tony Stanley. Richard English, who became a dean at Harvard. Dean at Howard. And a provost, Archie Epps, who became a dean at Harvard. They were in that class. I have pictures of them standing there in front of the museum. Well, yeah, that was a common practice all over the South, that one day a week. And the only whites you saw were either working in offices or the security guards, because there were no black security guards in those days.
Now, was Clark previously at Talladega before
Yes.
you came?
Yes.
You taught for a while.
Well, Clark had kind of shaken up things by challenging the University of Alabama when they had got borrowed works from the Metropolitan and other museums. This was, I think, around 1946 or 47, and may have been 48. But the people in those museums up north assumed that it was open to everybody. And, of course, they couldn't go at any time. And so Mr. Clark wrote to the director at the Cleveland Museum. At that time, I think it was Sherman Lee.
Yeah, sure, Sherman Lee.
Yes, and to the director at the Metropolitan Museum, and they all canceled their trips there and had the collections withdrawn. So it stirred up that kind of notion of inequality and what have you, but it also woke up people about how unfortunate it was that these things were happening.
So the arts were a battleground also.
It was a battleground, yeah, in many ways. Yeah.
Now, at Fisk, as we see in the image here, you see Elizabeth Catlett, Aaron Douglas. Now, when you got to Fisk, was it Aaron Douglas that was at Fisk when you first arrived?
Aaron Douglas had literally founded the art department at Fisk in 1939. He was invited there in 1931 to do the murals in the Cravette Library, but he didn't come to teach until around 1939.
And he organized the annual show, wasn't it? National
Yes,
annual?
he would. Well, it was different from the show in Atlanta. The annual show of Negro artists was in Atlanta, and that was organized in 1942 by Hale Woodruff. But Douglas had at the Carl Van Vechten Gallery,
okay.
he had invited prestigious artists from time to time to come, directors from Metropolitan Museum and places like that. And at Fisk, of course, it was not a very well-known notion, but George O'Keeffe had given 101 works, European and modern American masters, to Fisk University in 1949 in memory of her husband, Alfred Stieglitz. And so Fisk really, works like Blue Period Picasso, Cézanne, Renoir, et cetera, there were very few museums, period, in the South with that kind of representation.
Now, Carl Van Vechten, my understanding is that he introduced Stieglitz and O'Keeffe to Fisk University as a possibility. And the Stieglitz gave out, about 6 collections to 6 different five major institutions.
National Gallery,
including the National Gallery.
Chicago, Yale. Fisk was in that company.
Fisk was in that company. I think at National Gallery they gave 1,600 photographs from his collection that was later shown as the first major one-person show of photography in the country was held here. But now with this the collection given to Fisk University was exceptional, and there was writings about why Georgia gave it to Fisk, and I think it was Stieglitz who said, Negroes need to have exposure to this art as well. It was very important. Now, I know you were in communication with Georgia O'Keeffe. I think there's a letter behind us that shows that. Can you give us some background on how that came about, your relationship with Georgia O'Keeffe?
Well, when I left Howard University in 1966 to go to Fisk to be chairman of the art department and director of the gallery, I found things pretty much in disarray. They weren't very well kept. They actually, when Ms. O'Keeffe was there in 1949, she had marked on the linoleum floor in the Van Vechten Gallery where she wanted every piece to go with a red mark. And when I arrived there, that red mark was still there. That had been waxed over.
Right.
Well, there had been no conservation. The works needed conserving. And, they were just in pretty bad condition. So, in 1966, I got busy writing to different people, the Wilderson Gallery in New York, saying, if we can have a benefit, would you support us to raise money to restore the works, et cetera? And they said, sure. So I got in touch with Miss Doris Bree, who was Miss Keeffe's assistant, and said, the Wilderstein Gallery will sponsor this for us. We'd like to have X number of the works in New York at a given time. And Ms. Bree said, well, you have to go back and read the deed of gift. The works can't be loaned. And obviously they weren't supposed to be sold, anything like that. So I made a plea saying that these works are in bad condition. We need to do something about it. So I wrote to Ms. O'Keeffe and told her my plan. And of course, this letter came back, it's like the works don't improve with travel and so forth and so on. So the answer was no, nothing can be done.
You told Georgia O'Keeffe no?
No, she told me no.
Oh, okay.
And I said, well, we've got to do something. So 2 years later, I get a letter from Ms. Bree, a call from Ms. Bree saying, Ms. O'Keeffe is planning to have a major retrospective at the Whitney, and she would like to borrow Radiator Building. Mm-hmm. And I asked her to put it in writing and so forth, like she had done for me. And I responded by saying, my dear Miss O'Keeffe, I must remind you of the stringency of your gift. Regrettably, the works can't travel. Well, that, of course, caused her to say, have him come to see me And that was my plan.
That was your plan.
Yeah. So she always stayed at the Stanhope Hotel across the street from the Metropolitan Museum. And in one room, nobody stayed in that room but Miss O'Keeffe. So I went up in 1968 and to see her, and she and Miss Bree, and she was wearing the typical black dress, white collar, the medallion, and it said, "Okay." And I had, I said, "Oh, this is a beautiful medallion," and so forth. She said, "Oh, you like it?" She said, "Sandy made it for me." Luckily, I knew who Sandy was, Alexander Calder. It said, "Okay." So I think she was impressed with all the little trivia
That you knew.
yeah, and so forth.
You
She
were
said,
prepared
"Well, you
for
like
this."
it. Someday, maybe I'll give it to you someday." And Miss Bree stood up 6 feet 4 inches and said, "Miss O'Keeffe, we're giving away nothing today." And I thought, well, I've got to work out some way or another to get something, because I came here to
Can't go back
bargain.
home empty. Yeah, right.
I said to her then, I said, "Miss O'Keeffe, you were ahead of your time in so many ways, activists, women's rights, et cetera, et cetera." I said, "And you gave those works to a black school in the South in 1949? I said, "This was amazing." And I said, "But you didn't endow them. What did you expect going to happen to them?"
Mm-hmm.
And she looked at me and she said, "You got guts." She said, "But I like you." She said, "What do you want from me?" And I had my speech together. I said, "I need $50,000 immediately and I'll go to the National Endowment for the Arts." I said, "Dr. John Spencer has already told me that he would go to his discretionary funds and match whatever I can get from you." And she turned to Miss Bree and said, "Doris, I want a check for Mr. Fisk tomorrow." She forgot my name, but
Didn't matter, right?
didn't matter. And the check came special delivery about 3 days later. And of course, I got in touch with John, and he followed through, and we got the works conserved for the very first time.
It's amazing.
Felreth Hines was her conservation specialist, and she wouldn't let anybody else work on her works or anything in the collection.
So he came down and did the
He
work.
came, got the works, and worked on them.
Now you're about to go back to Washington, right? You're coming
Yes.
back to Washington, Howard University,
Right.
chairman of the art department.
No,
No?
associate professor.
Associate professor, I'm sorry. And you're working with students and you're involved.
But I became acting chairman in Professor Porter's
Acting
absence.
chairman when Professor
Yes.
Porter passed. Can you talk about that, returning from the South, coming back to Washington, D.C. and Howard University?
Well, it was in a way like coming home in many ways. And Fisk had really given me my start to do both art and scholarship. And I had done the 2 centuries of Black American art for the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. The publication, it had widespread distribution. So people then kind of, got to know that I was interested in both areas. On 2 special occasions, I chaired the Department of Art in Professor Porter's absence. And then when I left Howard in 1966 to go to Fisk, that's when I brought in artists like Jacob Lawrence, Romare Bearden, Palmer Hayden, and did catalogs of their works. And this hadn't been done before, with the exception of group shows for the most part. Charles White, we had the Toussaint Louverture series there by Jacob Lawrence, and I would invite the artists down. We had an artist in residence program, and these artists would come for like 3 days. But then we also had sponsorship from the Rockefeller Foundation, where an artist could come for a whole year. So Walter Williams came, Carlton Moss, the filmmaker, came from time to time. Jake Lawrence came as a visiting artist for like 3 days or so forth. But it was a very vibrant program, a very good time for artists. And up until recently, I think some of the artists who came, there was never a publication on their work prior to that.
I think you also were giving some of these artists their first academic or formal position at a university, didn't you? I think you told me you gave Martin Pure his first position at Fisk University. Was it Martin?
Well, Martin is from Washington, as you know, and he had attended the Catholic University of America for undergraduate work, and then he joined the Peace Corps. He was an undergraduate at CU when I was in graduate school, so we knew each other in that regard. But he went into the Peace Corps and went to Sierra Leone, and I had a letter. We stayed in touch, so I had a letter from him while he was there, and he said, "I'm thinking of going to graduate school when I come back to the States." He said, "But I'm going to Sweden and study furniture and design, what have you, printmaking. But when I return, what do you think? Where should I go to school?" And I said, "Choose either Yale or Cranbrook." Mm-hmm. So he chose Yale. So he finished up at Yale in 1971, and he wrote and said, "Now I've got a Master of Fine Arts degree, and I want to teach, but I don't have a job." And I said, "Well, I just happen to have an opening here at Fisk. Would you consider coming?" And he came, and he stayed 2 years. And he had his first one-person exhibition at Fisk.
At Fisk, sure.
And when he was beginning to break out of the tradition of regular sculptural work and doing more modernist forms.
Well,
and from there, he left and went to New York for a while, then came to the University of Maryland, and then
You came to the University of Maryland at
yes,
that point.
I came to
and
Maryland
began to teach
in
there.
77, and he was there at that
Right.
time, but he was there for only a year after I arrived.
So not only were you teaching young people and became the chairman at Maryland, is that the reason that you actually came to University of Maryland, the chairmanship?
I didn't come there as chair. I came there in January of 1977. I was recruited by Dr. George Levitine, who was a very well-known art historian of French art history, mainly 17th, 18th, 19th century French art. And he had heard me lecture here on the Harlem Renaissance, and he was impressed. And he asked Professor Richard Clank, who was on the faculty at that time, whom I had known from graduate school at CU, to get in touch with me to see if I would be interested in coming there to teach, to introduce courses in African American art history. And that's how that got going. I came in the spring of 1977. Dr. Levitine went on leave, the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton. I think it was one of the first times that an art historian had been invited. And someone took his place as acting chair. But then he decided he would not resume the chairmanship. And so the search went out, and I was appointed chair in 1978.
Now, there was a little jealousy by some of your colleagues, right, that you had had this attention and support at University of Maryland. Didn't you tell me once that chair had argued and explained to his colleagues and your colleagues that you had defined the field? You had produced a body of
Professor
work.
Levitine did that. I didn't have a PhD. I had honorary degrees and so forth. But there was some concern about my teaching PhD students. And Dr. Levitine came to my defense, and he said, if this man were at Harvard, you wouldn't even ask what kind of degree he had. He said, he's defined the field, and how many of you have defined the field?
That was
So
the end of that, huh?
That kind of took care of that.
Good. These are some images that are up about your work with students and your teachers at the University of Maryland. How did you find your experience coming back to the D.C. area and Maryland after being away for quite a while, but also the institutions and the reaction to the work of African American artists? Now, you have produced a large body of work. catalogs, essays, and 2 centuries. So you were impacting institutions, and institutions were now understood that they had to acquire those works, acknowledge those works, and document those works. How did you find the Washington, D.C. environment in regards to those issues and concerns?
Well, there was a welcoming attitude in many ways because, remember, I'm patterning my introduction of the studies at Maryland after what I've learned at Howard University. Now, Howard is still doing exhibitions of African American artists, so it wasn't an estranged area. So when I introduced the courses on the undergraduate level at the University of Maryland in 1978, students enrolled. And the word kind of got around that, you know, there was a new area of study within the American art curriculum. It was never separate. Elizabeth Johns was over the American art at that time. And she was very, very cooperative and helpful. And students who had taken the courses on the undergraduate level then said, well, we'd like to take these courses on the graduate level. And that's when the discussion ensued about,
Sure.
you know, I don't have a doctorate, and why am I teaching PhD and master's students? Well, that blew over, and students started coming. One of the first students we got on the master's level was a young lady by the name of Renee Eta from Oberlin College. And she told me a year or so ago how she chose Maryland. I had gone to the Toledo Museum of Art in the 1980s to deliver a lecture, and she came from Oberlin. And she said she decided she wanted to be like that man teaching this course. And so when she found out that I was teaching at Maryland, she came and enrolled, and she went all the way through the PhD. Well, there were other students like that.
Yeah, I know a few of them that had been inspired by your
Adrian
career.
Charles, Talisa
Fleming,
and many
curators.
others. At one time, I think we probably had the lead in producing PhD students in the field of African American art history.
When you look back, though, how do you think about that in the context of what's happening with African American history now? This is sort of a divergent, but that you were working on that foundation, making those arguments, trying to get these artists recognized, Claude Clark, Jacob Lawrence, all of them recognized. And now when you come back, and I think you employed Sam Gilliam for a while at the University of Maryland.
Sam came and taught for us.
Keith
for
Morrison
about 3
you
years.
employed.
Yeah, Keith
and,
Morrison, Stephanie Pogue.
So these artists now have received acclaim and recognition, and in large part due to your efforts to open that canon up. How do you look at that now, seeing this accomplishment? I know Bearden was taking on a similar role, you know, trying to make it possible for artists to be recognized that were of color.
Well, it wasn't easy, and it was the only institution in the area at that time that was bringing these students in on that particular level. I mean, we had the master's level at Howard University, but didn't have the PhD level in art history. So I think they felt comfortable coming there with a faculty like me, Keith Morrison,
Sure.
Sam Gilliam, Stephanie Pogue, and others who had a measure of influence in their lives at that time. So Maryland imprinted the national scene a certain way. By that time, we had perhaps graduated 5 or 6 people with a PhD in American art history with emphasis on African American.
You know, it's kind of interesting because when you study, you often look at texts written by authors that you have no connection to. So here these students are looking at texts that you have written. I remember being in undergraduate school and there was only a thin pamphlet of Elizabeth Catlett show. Although Huey Lee Smith had attended the Cleveland Institute of Art, Charles Soleil, but no documentation, just a slim catalog or brochure of Elizabeth Catlett. So here in these courses that you're teaching, you're actually teaching from your own text. I think this is kind of interesting. And I remember we were in Chicago visiting Kerry James Marshall, and the first thing he did was pull that copy of 2 Centuries off his shelf to have you sign it. And I saw that with Theaster Gates. I've seen it so many times where these scholars have attributed their success to you establishing that foundation.
Well, I think perhaps the classical example would be when Mark Bradford came to the High Museum 3 years ago to receive the David C. Driscoll Prize. The $25,000 prize is given annually to an art historian or a practicing artist on an annual basis. And he was accosted and they said, look, you get $5 million for your painting. Why would you come down here and take $25,000?
Award, yeah. Which is the largest award given to any African-American artist and scholar, to my knowledge, in the country.
Yes. So he said, it's not about, and as my friends very often say, you're so articulate. Mark was so articulate. He won't mind my saying that.
Right.
Mark said, I am receiving this award because this man has labored over the years to make it possible. He said, I'm paraphrasing him, but basically that's what he said. He said he probably has forsaken his own art, pushing people like me and others. He said, and I'm standing on their shoulders now. And
Sure.
He said, this is why I am receiving this award. And he said, it's not that I need the money. He said, I'll give it to my foundation and it'll go out to others, which I thought was an interesting way of putting it.
But you hadn't forsaken your art. You had always done your art.
Well, I tried, yeah.
And you were recognized for that contribution here by the president of Maryland. You received a presidential award. But then you had an exhibition. In the following slide, you'll see an exhibition you had at, this is the narratives gathering that you put together. But later you had your own one-person show.
Bomoni.
Gallery.
In San Francisco.
One-person show in San Francisco. So you were still making art, and you were receiving recognition for making that art. Here you were Lovelace O'Neill, and a few other people you recognized at those images?
Keith Morrison.
Keith Morrison.
I can't recognize the other person.
This is at the University of Maryland College Park. You
Yeah.
hosted exhibition of their work. So you were giving platforms, not just jobs and documenting their work, but you were giving a platform for them to show. So it only illustrates how important it is to be in a position of power and authority, to be at the table so you could impact the canon. You can't do it when you're not at the table. You
Well,
have to
that's
be
true.
present.
People would say to me, why are you serving on the Board of Trustees of the American Federation of Arts? This was in the 60s. Or why are you, why would you leave Fisk and come up to be on a panel at NEA and so forth and so on? Well, like you say, if you're not at the table and you don't really know what's going on, and it's important to be there regardless of what someone else may think your role is.
Sure.
And frankly speaking, I was never out there waving a banner, but I knew what I was doing, and I knew it was important, and I had to keep at it, regardless of what people said. No, I wasn't getting any great measure of pleasure, or certainly wasn't getting any money for doing it.
But you're willing to spend that 10,000 hours at work to make it happen. And you were recognized nationally for that by President Clinton for that contribution, National Humanities Award, and the dinner with the Clintons at the White House, and that napkin that you slipped out of there, the presidential napkin. You still have that?
I still have it.
So this now is national recognition. I know you're in Europe, interesting enough, in Europe, they have begun making videos about the narratives and interviewing you on BBC. So America was recognized, but they also were slow to give the kind of prominence. And I remember you telling me a story. You were on an interview, and I think Hughes, the popular critic, said that, well, we don't need to be looking at African American art. It's not important art being made. And there was a commentator.
Hilton Kramer.
Hilton Kramer.
Yeah.
And there was a commentator who said it was critically important, not just a commentator, but he was a scholar at Princeton, wasn't he?
Sam Hunter.
Sam Hunter was Bob Madison's teacher, but he stood and said, no, this is important work.
Yeah, Hilton Kramer and I used to have our ups and downs. In 1976, when 2 Centuries of Black American Art exhibition came to the Brooklyn Museum, Hilton Kramer was the big art critic for the New York Times. And he took up about 3/4 of a page in the Sunday Times, literally putting the exhibition down. No such thing as black art, it's social history. Well, everything is social history, but he didn't realize that I was going to have a comeback. So Tom Brokaw invited me on to the Today Show. And he, of course, said, well, but Hilton Kramer says there's no such thing as black art. I said, who is Hilton Kramer? You know. After that, we had our fight back and forth. And then when Sam Hunter wrote the book on corporate sponsorship of art in America and devoted 12 pages to 2 centuries, then Kramer comes up again. He says, why would a scholar like Sam Hunter devote time to what he was really saying, this misfit, David Driscoll, is out there doing, and so forth and so on. And my response was, Mr. Kramer, all you're doing is making me famous in New York, because nobody knows who I am. If you're going to write about me every Sunday,
Yeah.
they're going to know who I am. And I come to the office, and my chairman, Dr. Levitine, would say, you made the New York Times. I said, but look what they say. It doesn't matter what they said. You made the New York Times.
Yeah.
So I don't think Mr. Kramer knew that he was giving me a platform.
So that has been an ongoing struggle to assert the value and the brilliance of these artists and the genius of these artists.
Yeah.
Now you were influenced, I think, when you were at Catholic school by a philosopher, Etienne
Gilson?
Yeah, influenced you quite a bit, and the ideal that the artist could be genius and the art of the beautiful. And you made it a part of your work because it also talked about a spirituality and work, and I know you're a very spiritual man. So can you talk about how you took that influence and then brought it into the classroom and brought it into your teaching of students?
Well, I think one of the most important aspects of my graduate study at Catholic University, and I did a postgraduate study over in Holland at the Netherlands Institute for the History of Art, but in The Hague. But prior to that, it was there was a woman who taught painting and art theory at Catholic University by the name of Nell Sonneman. She was my teacher, Claudia de Monte's teacher, Martin Puryear's teacher, etc. And she introduced us to all of these modern-day thinkers who wrote about art, but from the point of view of theory, not just history. Jacques Maritain, Sir Herbert Reed, and Etienne Gilson, and so many others. And their vocabulary became, to a certain extent, a part of ours through that course study of not just looking at the object, but what is the relationship of the object to time, to place, to history, et cetera? What else is going on there? And so I started incorporating some of that into my own teaching. And I got involved in doing that up in Maine with the Institute for Doctoral Studies in Visual Arts, which is the only program in the United States now which is not doctoral program, which is not connected to an institution. It's standalone, And that is the emphasis of that program. A painter, a poet, a dancer, a writer with an MFA can come into that program and get a PhD if they have that kind of orientation.
And they saw the visual arts as a form of scholarship.
Yes,
and
it's
serious research.
an extension beyond just the practice. And my advice to the founder of that program was, and he invites me to come to Tuscany every summer to lecture there. I don't go every summer, of course. It's a 12th century castle, a 1,200-acre. Did you go?
I haven't been. I was
Okay.
invited, but I couldn't.
1,200-acre organic farm. They press their own olive oil, their own wine. They do their own prosciutto and all that kind of thing. It's the whole of living in that one environment. And they go there for X number of weeks, and the visiting lecturers come in. I was there this past summer. And then they go to other places, to Milano to see Leonardo's Last Supper, and to other cities and what have you around. We go to Paris, to the Louvre, and places like that. So my approach to teaching incorporated aspects of theory that got notice from people like Dr. George Smith, and then he invited me to come in as visiting faculty for that.
Well, the sensibility also finds itself in your work, I think, your visual work. Doing maybe two approaches or focus on two kinds of work. One that is, I think, is a certain kind of spiritual romantic work in a way. And then others have been social commentary, like we see in these two pieces that are up, like Ghetto Walls and Black Ghetto. So you're making comments on the environment, the social issues that were occurring. And we can go on and look at other pieces that were Ghetto Wall, another large piece. And these have been receiving a lot of attention, these works. And I've seen them in Miami at Art Basel. But at the same time, you are pursuing works that are more investigation of aesthetics. So it's one thing that you learn in a school of arts is that oftentimes it's important to choose an inanimate object, an object that gives you no information at all, and that you interpret that object. You bring information to that object. So these are the green chair, an antique chair. The chair is not sending you this information.
No, but I've gone from one series of works, everybody knows about the pine series. I labored with these pine trees because I didn't want to paint people. The people were, were being pretty rough.
Yeah, this is Pines and Falmouth.
But the trees were so willing to be
available
in partners, After I did, in 1956, Behold Thy Son, as a symbol of the hate, the death of Emmett Till, I just felt like I didn't want to paint any more people. And so I went to painting trees and things like that. And then I came back to the social scene and started painting people, but they were in a setting which dealt with, how should I put it, human relationships. So this is
Behold Thy Son.
Behold Thy Son. This is over at the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
It's 1956.
1956, a year after Till's death.
was murdered.
And I was teaching at Talladega at that time, and I was just so angry and caught up with, the civil rights movement was in force at that time, even on the campus. We went over to Anderson, Alabama, and protesting, and the people came out with chains and broken bottles and shotguns and things. It's unbelievable how those things were happening. So I come back and I see this out of my own religious experience of the cross, the burden that the African American has. This is what we are up against. And yet, this is a powerful statement about who we are and how we have changed America. We have contributed positively to the moral code
Of the country, sure.
and have said you must adhere to the constitutional law in this regard and so forth. So for me, this was cathartic. It cleansed me of that hate that I had. I had studied 3 years earlier with Jack Levine up at Skowhegan, and I was still interested in social commentary.
He was known for it in his work.
But I learned later that that was not the answer for me. That maybe even a filmmaker could do it better, a writer could do it better. And so I kind of moved on to
And
other
you know, you're asking a work of art to be an instrument of social change, and that's a lot to put on ask of a work of art.
Plus, it's static. It doesn't change. It's forever there once.
But that's been one of the challenges is for the art world to recognize that African American artists, like all artists, have not only a concern about social issues and issues of identity, but they're dealing with a sense of their own emotionality, their existential reality, their being in the world. What does it mean to be a human? My emotional reaction to an event or a situation. It's almost like there's no belief that African Americans could be that dynamic in their personality, that they can only paint an image that has something to do with the social dilemma of being black in America. Well, it's far more complicated. I think Martin Puryear is an example of an artist that will not be restricted to that conversation. He transcends that conversation.
Well, Lois Jones used to say, up until the end, she said, yes, I'm a proud African-American artist. And I think I've made my contribution and so forth. She said, but I would just like to be an American artist. I just like to be human.
And you are a humanist. I mean, we've talked many times about your connection to this sense of humanity and the humanity of students, that students have potential, individuals have potential, and that potential needs to be nurtured and encouraged. And you have a firm faith in the potential of your fellow human. I've noticed that about you, and it probably makes you an exceptional teacher because of that embracing of that value. Now, this is another Big Pines. But before I go forward to Japan, there's another Big Pine. But again, this is the argument I'm making, that there's a pine tree near your home, I imagine, in Falmouth. You're surrounded by pine trees. But the pine tree is not giving you that color. It's not giving you that light reflection. As a creative artist and a creative genius, you're imposing that on that vehicle. The vehicle is the pine tree. But there's a great lesson in art. If you want to know what an effective work of art is, it has three elements. One is called design. That is the subject, you know, the assignment. What am I looking at? I'm looking at a still life. The second is modulation, how that particular artist has affected that still life, chose palette, color, chose technique. And then the third is recapitulation. How does a person respond to what that artist chose to do? So the talent is in that modulation, the talent is in that choice. Not necessarily the subject, but how you deal with it. So this is David, and we did an exhibition of his work in Osaka, Japan. And these are graduate students whose assignment was to research David's work and to make commentary on the exhibition. Out of this exhibition, David sold a number of pieces out of this exhibition, but one of the clients was a chocolatier, produces chocolate. He walked in and he asked, could he have copyright privileges to take one of David's pieces to put on his chocolate boxes for Valentine's Day to be circulated all over Asia. The last time they did that, it was a Basquiat on the box. Now there's a David Driscoll on the box. Now, the understanding, I negotiated this little deal. Where's Rodney at? The understanding was that we would receive the royalties. Not Rodney, but we would receive the royalties. No, but I know they paid royalties, and it was very successful. So you're eating chocolates, and you see a David Driscoll on the wrapper of the chocolates. But it's about how the work has transcended its boundaries. So I mentioned to you before that I was going to talk to you about a couple of other stories about David. David was in Italy Dorita and I were in Athens, Greece, doing a conference, and we were doing a presentation. I was doing a talk about collaboration and working with David. Dorita was talking about the David Driscoll Center, also David. So she did a presentation, and I followed up. This was an international conference. Well, David decided to come over from Italy in time to see us present, and he reminded us that he had 2 students that were in Athens, Greece. One of the students, Sophia, how do you pronounce that last name?
Zarambuka.
Zarambuka. And the other one was named Betty.
Betty Nikagiatrakas.
So they wanted to give David a birthday party. So they had an apartment on top of a building, and they fixed a phenomenal lamb dinner. And we're looking at the Acropolis just across, lit up at night. And what we find out is that Sophia is an illustrator of note, children's books. She brought out her journal from being a student at 1961, I think it was. She was beginning as a student at Howard University. She and David and other students had participated in the March on Washington in 1963. He had his students out there, and she had made a drawing of David in that march. That was amazing that was happening, but he's connecting with his students. Now, we're amazed at how these students got to Howard University. Well, Betty explained that she was looking for a college, a university, and she discovered that the official colors of Howard University, I think, were blue and white, and the flag looked like the Greek flag. And upon greater research, she found out they taught Greeks as a language at Howard. She was mistaken. They had a Greek
Letter organization.
fraternity, but she thought they taught Greece. She said she actually came there, and the other student was there when she arrived, Sophia, and they were just so happy to see each other. The black female co-students would say, "Oh no, there's another Greek on campus. Let's take you to her." And she eventually started teaching Greece to the fraternity brothers, she said. I thought it was the most amazing story.
That was after 44 years.
This is after 44 years
We hadn't
that
seen
we're
them
having
for
this
44
party
years.
for David's birthday.
At
It
that
was-
time, Howard University, I must say, Howard, and it still is, Howard is a major institution any way you look at it. But at that time, Howard was an international university. I had students from Pakistan, from India, from Greece, from Iraq,
Sure.
from China, all over, in South America as well. And some of the students I do keep in touch with.
So that was phenomenal. Dorit and I were just blown away by this. And they came into the conference. They hadn't seen him in 40 years, and they were just had their hands all over him. They were just loving their professor. "Oh, we missed you. We loved you." And me and Dorit, we're kind of tripped out that this is happening. But they were great hosts, and it was a wonderful moment. Go on. Yeah, one more story as we close, so you can have a few moments for questions. I had been studying Costa Rica, Mexico, and also in Costa Rica. So I arranged for the publication of a large print by David. I think it is his masterpiece. It's called Woman in Interior, like 30 by 40 inches. So I took a whole crew with me, printmakers. We had 2 students, a book artists with us, and we all went.
Dr. Julie McGee.
Julie McGee did the filming, I think. We went to San Jose, Costa Rica, rented the penthouse of a hotel building. We're all up there. So we're doing great work, and we get a phone call one night. Now, I've been going back and forth to Costa Rica for years. And we get a phone call one night, and the woman on the end of the phone identified herself as a curator of the Presidential Collection in Costa Rica, and said, "We understand David Driscoll is in town in San Jose." Now, I was a little hesitant. Now, I've been coming to Costa Rica for 10 years, and nobody ever called and said Curly was in town, But David was in town, so we had a special visit to the Presidential Palace, and in that collection now is Woman in Interior, the painting. Thank you.